at the event. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lucy, and welcome everyone to this very important event celebrating the 75th anniversary of the International Whaling Commission. I wanted firstly to thank the Wildlife and Countryside Link, the umbrella organisation, which I'm a board member of, for helping organise this event with its key member organisations that are directly involved in marine conservation and protection, all of whom have contributed to this event today. And I want to just name them quickly so that we know exactly who's been involved in this. And the Born Free Foundation I begin with, who I work with. We have the Danish Marine Mammal Society, the Environmental Investigation Agency, Fundación Cethus, the Humane Society International, IFAW, ORCA, OceanCare, Pro Wildlife, Whale and Dolphin Conservation, and obviously, as I said at the beginning, Wildlife and Countryside Link. So thank you to everyone who's contributed and helped organize this event. The event itself will be in two sections, effectively. First of all, we're going to look back at the history of the International Whaling Commission since 1946. Remember, this organization was established at a time when industrial killing of whales was pushing this species to the verge of global extinction. And it's seen a lot of changes in its history. Thankfully, by 1982, it actually brought about a moratorium on commercial whaling, which has really begun to turn the corner for how we can protect these species in our oceans around the world. And we'll hear more about that today. But clearly there are more challenges ahead, and that's the crucial discussion we're going to be having. But also we're going to hear today from the non-governmental organizations, the conservation organizations, many of which I mentioned earlier, about what it is that they want to see in terms of the global conservation of whales, dolphins, and other cetaceans in a world which, as we know from COP26 in Glasgow over a few weeks ago, is rapidly changing with a climate emergency, which is directly impacting on life on this planet in every way possible, both for humans and the natural world as well. So it's a crucial time to be having this discussion. I'm very pleased to be involved, and thank you to everyone who's actually participated and played a role making this happen. I want to introduce, to begin with, a message from a naturalist and conservationist who I had the pleasure to know and work with over the years, to give her perspective on why this is such an important event today, and that's Dr. Jane Goodall. Thank you.
Hello. This is Jane Goodall. Some 80% of the world's oxygen comes from the ocean. Our seas, along with our forests, are literally the lungs of our planet. Tragically, the vast marine habitat is increasingly threatened by our human actions. We're polluting it with toxic substances. Large areas become acidified. The water is warming. Commercial fishing has endangered many species, and its biggest and so loved residents, whales, dolphins, and porpoises, are suffering. Unbelievably, despite a 40-year ban, many still suffer the cruelty of commercial whaling. Then around 300,000 cetaceans die when they're accidentally captured in fishing gear. They drown. A number of species and some populations are now facing extinction. There are solutions, but our governments must prioritize them and also recognize and support the International Whaling Commission, the IWC, as the organization to coordinate these global priorities. The IWC has managed and conserved whales for 75 years. It has evolved from a body that managed whale numbers simply to ensure there were enough whales to be hunted, and now one that has whale conservation at the very heart of its mission. That mission and the responsibility to support it has never been clearer or more urgent for its 88 member governments. Today, as we celebrate the IWC's milestone anniversary, I urge its members to ensure that the IWC is at the center of all global efforts to address all threats to whales and dolphins, for the sake of these incredible animals, for the sake of the next generation who care so deeply about our planet, and for the health of the precious ocean upon which we all rely. We must not fail. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Wonderful, wise words from Jane Goodall, and a very powerful, emotive film we've just seen there, looking back at the terrible history of commercial whaling, but why it's so important to protect these beautiful species today. Now, we will have a panel session closing this event today. So if you want to put in some questions on some of the issues that are already probably no doubt in your mind from what Jane has said in the film you've just seen, please go to the Q&A session and you can start putting in those questions there, and we'll start looking at those and how we can put them to our expert panel later on. Next speaker that we have is Andrej Bibič, Chair of the International Whaling Commission and Commissioner for Slovenia. Now, he's going to give us a vision of where the IWC is in terms of its past history, but also the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in the 21st century to protect the future of these magnificent animals. Thank you.
Thank you for offering me the opportunity to say a few words today. In fact, these are words that I have repeated a few times during this year, and that you will hear again at the Commission's commemorative event on 2nd of December. They are central to our understanding of where the IWC is today and how it arrived here. The message is that the milestone 75th anniversary is not simply about endurance or longevity, but about evolution and collaboration. As the chair of the IWC, it is important to say that the mandate of the IWC has not changed and stands as it did in 1946 to manage whaling and conserve whale stocks. Whilst commercial whaling has been subject to moratorium since 1986, Aboriginal subsistence whaling remains a fundamental role of the IWC, and of course the scientific committee continues to deliver on its own vital mandate to gather and assess the latest information on whale stocks, their migration, abundance, growth, reproduction, and other characteristics, and to conduct the mathematical modeling that this committee pioneered and that has since been emulated in other fora. Obtaining the best scientific advice to inform Commission decision-making remains as fundamental as it was in 1946. The IWC mandate has not changed, but the world around has transformed immeasurably, and our knowledge has increased and continues to increase all the time. There are very few audiences that will be more aware than you that the range of the threats facing whales today is greatly expanded and vastly different to anything that our original 14 signatories could have predicted. The mathematical models devised by the scientific committee are now used to assess the impacts of bycatch and entanglement, ship strikes, ocean noise, debris and pollution, and of course, climate change. And whilst the IWC was undoubtedly a collaborative effort from the onset, in those early days, I also don't think anyone could have predicted the many different kinds of organizations and institutions that now come together to study cetaceans, or the multidisciplinary teams that are formed to effectively address today's threats to them. The 50-year vision document launching today sets out clearly the range of threats, the efforts, the actions, and the collaborative effort needed to address them. Now, the slide gives a snapshot of the scientific and conservation work that the IWC is already doing to tackle today's threats to cetaceans. It is very hard to highlight just a couple of these initiatives, but I have chosen two of them. One is threat-based and one is species-based. In the first I have chosen, because it cannot possibly be ignored and has already been mentioned, sadly, 300,000 estimated cetaceans are killed in bycatch every year, the single biggest threat today. The IWC endorsed plans for a bycatch mitigation initiative in 2016, and now it works at every level, bringing together artisanal fisheries, economists, scientists, fishing gear, and technology companies and regulators, and working with the FAO, regional fisheries management organizations, and other international organizations to raise awareness, assess and address bycatch in locations around the world. Please give me a second. to get rid of the slide. Thank you. The second initiative I'd like to highlight is small cetacean task teams. They're relatively new and focused on a specific population or species rather than a type of threat. In another reflection of the changing world and pace of change around us, the task team concept was developed in order to provide rapid and agile responses to sudden population declines. Task teams are currently working to halt and reverse declines in South Asian river dolphins, African Sousa, and Lahile's Bottlenose Dolphin. Collaboration is again at the core of this concept. Each task team relies on local expertise and authorities and works in conjunction with other IWC programs. There is another important connection between these and many other work programs underway at the IWC, and that is the support they have received from organizations and individuals here today. Many of you have first-hand experience on working on the BMI, task teams, and other IWC work programs. Some of you have provided a driving force behind their creation. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very sincerely for working with the IWC, for sharing your expertise and contributing in many cases your time, your expertise, and your funding to the initiatives and work programs that are essential if we are to stand any chance of delivering on our mandate of whale conservation. I thank you also for developing the 50-year vision, and I have read it with great interest. The Commission is, of course, considering some changes to the way we work through the governance review and operational effectiveness working group. I know many of you have engaged in this process, and I encourage your continued participation. There are, of course, different visions within the IWC community on what the next 50 years should look like. If the IWC is together again in another 50 years, or for that matter, another 75 years, it is important that we listen to and respect all these views. It is also important that we recognize that whatever our viewpoint, it will be absolutely essential to continue to respond to the world around us and continue to work together, to keep evolving and keep collaborating. Thank you once more for your support and for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you very much, Andrej, and thank you for those warm words when it comes to cooperation and working with NGOs and the conservation movement. I think we all very much appreciate that, particularly in relation to your future vision and the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. So thank you. We're now going to focus on the British government. Obviously, coming from Britain, I'm pleased to say that it doesn't really matter what the government has been in recent decades. We've had a strong commitment to protecting whales around the world and supporting the work of the International Whaling Commission, not least with our current Minister, Lord Goldsmith, UK Minister for International Environment. We've now got James Smith, who will be just delivering a brief statement from Lord Goldsmith. Thank you.
Thank you. And firstly, a very warm welcome wherever you're joining from around the world. I'm delighted to be here today as UK Commissioner to the International Whaling Commission to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the IWC. I'm also here today on behalf of Lord Goldsmith, UK Minister for the Pacific and the Environment, and I'll pass on a few personal words from him a little later. Now, 75 years is a remarkable anniversary, and the UK is proud to have been involved with the IWC from the very start, not just as a founding member in 1946, back when we were a whaling nation, but as the host of its dedicated and beloved Secretariat. My department, then the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, hosted the Secretariat in London for almost 3 decades before the Commission secured the Secretariat its own office space and it moved to Cambridge in 1976. And it's a real testament to the professionalism of the Secretariat and the global significance of its work that several of its staff have spent their entire careers serving with the IWC. And I want to really pay tribute to our Secretariat today and thank them deeply for their service. Now, the UK is proud that we have supported the IWC over the last 75 years, both to advance the conservation of all cetaceans globally and where whaling is conducted to meet Aboriginal subsistence needs, ensuring it's sustainable, well-regulated, and done to the highest of welfare standards. We've hosted countless commission and scientific meetings, I believe the majority, if not all of them, in the first few decades. And today, we're really honoured to be involved in a number of IWC groups and functions where we're making a real difference in such a crucial time where cetaceans are facing so many threats. We're really proud that we're a member of the IWC's Bureau, where we work with other commissioners to oversee the work of the IWC during the intersessional periods, in supporting the IWC chair and strengthening really the coordination and communication of the Commission's really important work. We're Vice Chair of the Conservation Committee, where we help to deliver the strategic plan for healthy and well-managed cetacean populations worldwide, providing that robust conservation advice and addressing priority global threats to cetaceans. We're Chair of the Voluntary Conservation Fund Steering Group, which of course helps to deliver on the diverse and really growing conservation programme of work that supports the Conservation Committee's strategic plan. And finally, we're co-chair of the Working Group on Operational Effectiveness, where we are committed to working with all parties of the IWC to continue to support the modernisation of the organisation and to really ensure it remains the international body for the conservation and management of cetaceans going forward. We're hugely grateful to the civil society organisations hosting this event today and presenting their vision of the IWC to us. NGOs have been active stakeholders in the IWC from its earliest years. They represent the views of citizens around the world whose values and priorities have changed since 1946. Since then, we've moved far from a time when the world considered whales only through the lens of hunting. Most notably, the 1986 moratorium on commercial whaling reduced pressures on vulnerable whale populations and has crucially allowed them to recover. And the UK is a strong supporter of that moratorium remaining in place. Since the IWC's inception, we've learned so much about cetaceans, their unique physiology, habitat needs and population structures, their cultures, their sentience and their vulnerability. We now understand more about the role of cetaceans in ocean ecosystems, including their role in carbon sequestration. The IWC's work today and its plans for the future reflect that change in society's understanding and its values. Now, the challenges that cetaceans face today are really wide-ranging, and the IWC's breadth of work recognises this. From bycatch to ship strikes, strandings to pollution, the IWC's work, including through the excellent scientific committee, has contributed invaluable knowledge that has informed our understanding of, and therefore our ability to tackle, these threats to cetaceans. In the UK, we have been inspired by the IWC's bycatch mitigation initiative and will soon be launching our own plan to minimise and, where possible, eliminate the bycatch of cetaceans and other marine species in UK waters. It's also important to recognise how the IWC's work intersects with other multilateral agreements. The UK is playing a leading role in developing an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're calling for ambitious global targets to bend the curve of biodiversity loss by 2030. This includes targets to ensure at least 30% of the land and the ocean globally are protected, ecosystems are restored, species population sizes are recovering, and that by 2050 extinctions are halted. We also know that action to protect and restore the ocean is essential in our response to climate change. At COP26, the UK presidency used its focus on nature to call for ambitious action to protect and restore ocean health and resilience. And we're pleased that COP26 agreed to give a more prominent role to the ocean in global climate change discussions. And to conclude, I'd like to read a statement from Lord Goldsmith, UK Minister for the Pacific and Environment, who I hope most of you will know well already. I'm proud that the UK plays a leading role championing the conservation and welfare of all cetaceans, both in the UK and internationally. I want to congratulate the International Whaling Commission on its 75th anniversary and thank all those who have been involved, from the IWC staff to all of the commissioners who reflect our diverse range of views, and the civil society organisations who continue to advocate for cetacean conservation worldwide. The IWC has and will continue to play a vital part in ensuring that there is a strong international framework for the conservation and management of cetaceans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very good to hear from James there about the ongoing commitment of the British government, both to the Secretariat and the workings of the IWC, but also as a member state, and how important it is for Britain, not least during the presidency of COP26 in Glasgow, to make ocean conservation and protecting cetaceans a key priority, which we know is so crucial going forward as well. I now want to play a short video from another naturalist and broadcaster I know well, Mr. Chris Packham. Thank you.
But I just wanted to have a few moments to add my small voice to congratulate the IWC, because they've gone from a regulatory body regulating commercial whaling to a conservation body and done a tremendous amount of good work. So congratulations are in order, but as ever, I'm afraid there's no room for complacency, more work to be done. Commercial whaling continues, as you know, and we want to put a stop to that as soon as possible. But our whales and dolphins also face other problems. Bycatch, being entangled in fishing nets, accounts for tens of thousands, or if not hundreds of thousands of these animals every year. Bioaccumulation of chemicals which we discharge into the oceans. Consumption of plastic, we know, is a very serious problem. I think at this point it's almost pertinent as well to think about why we are so driven to protect this group of animals. Clearly, we love them. They are extraordinarily beautiful, fascinating, and they have amazing life cycles and life histories. They're long-lived, sociable, have complex vocalizations and communication, echolocation to find their food, and of course they are highly intelligent too. So that's what they are, and what they are is remarkable and worthy of protection. But spare a thought also for what they do. I was reading New Scientist the other day. Scientists have discovered that our largest whales, the baleen whales, eat a lot more than we thought they did, which means that they poo a lot more than we thought they did. And this poo is the basic foodstuff in the ocean for phytoplankton, which is then consumed by zooplankton, which is then consumed by the krill, which the whales are eating. So you might think of these animals as marine ecosystem engineers. They're integrally important to the proper functioning of our marine ecosystems. And at a time when it's so critical that we address this because of the impacts of climate change, then looking after our whales is more than about just those whales. It's about what those whales can do for everything else that lives in those oceans.
Well, thank you very much from Chris, and obviously reminding us that, you know, there's a direct connection between whales and how they function as a species in our oceans and the climate crisis that we face. I'm sure that's going to come up more in the panel later as well, but a crucial point for us all to focus on. We're now going to move from looking at the IWC from a government perspective to looking at the vision of the IWC over the next 50 years from the non-governmental organisations and conservation bodies that have played such an important role in today's event. Our next speaker is Mark Simmons, OBE, a marine biologist, environmental scientist, Director of Science at OceanCare, a visiting research fellow at the University of Bristol. He's also chaired of the UK Marine Animal Rescue Coalition. For more than a quarter of a century, has been a member of the scientific committee of the IWC. And he's actually said that this speech reflects his own views, but he is a man of huge experience and knowledge, and it's a real pleasure to have him speak to us today. So thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Dominic. That's very kind of you. Let's share the screen and start the PowerPoint. There we go. So, hello. The cetaceans, or as they're commonly known, the whales, dolphins, and porpoises, currently constitute some 90 or so species and many discrete populations. And they live all across our increasingly busy seas and in some of our big river systems. I will focus on particular cetaceans and try and draw some lessons from them. This lovely photograph on my opening slide shows orcas seen off northern Norway just a few days ago in what might deceptively appear to be a pristine situation. However, places where our activities are having little impact on such animals are increasingly rare, and I'll return to these orcas later. But first I have to illustrate for you how terrible our impacts on whales in the 21st century can be. This is a brooder's whale, photographed in mid-Atlantic. And as you can see, this one has what is almost certainly fishing netting caught in its mouth. There are goose barnacles growing on the netting, but we can't be sure if the whale was ensnared when the net was in active use, as happens in the majority of cases, and the barnacles have grown subsequently, or whether the whale became entangled after the net was lost. Either way, the whale has been left with this life-changing burden. If we look closer, you will see that the drag on the net is slowly pulling it through the upper jaw, causing a wound that is cutting into the bone. There are a multitude of cuts and scrapes on the side of the animal, which are being caused by the netting and the barnacles rubbing against it. And notice also the strange white marks on the body of the animal. Experts believe that these scars are probably the result of an earlier incident, a major boat strike. So this poor whale was likely recovering from significant injury, only to end up with this entanglement. On the other flank of the whale, he or she has picked up some hitchhiking organisms, showing that this animal has really been slowed down by the netting. And not surprisingly, the whale is also in poor body condition. The netting may well have compromised its ability to feed. This unfortunate whale is almost certainly on a long and painful journey to death, a journey that will take months or even years. For example, the average time for an entangled North Atlantic right whale to die from such an entanglement has been estimated at 6 months. That's 6 long, painful months, and that's the average. These chronic entanglements are a most severe welfare issue, and for some species and populations, like the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, clearly also a serious conservation matter. Many smaller cetaceans in many habitats are also taken incidentally in fishing nets. The figure that you've heard cited is a little dated now, but it is clear that for many populations, this is the most immediate factor pushing them towards extinction. I want to show you a much nicer image now of a brooder's whale from the excellent IWC CMS online whale watching handbook, which you can find on the IWC website. Consideration of brooder's whales gives me the opportunity to say something more. New species of cetaceans are still being discovered. And this is much more than a scientific curiosity because of the very important role that species definitions play in directing our conservation efforts. Arguably, there are 2 main reasons for these new discoveries. First, some cetaceans are only very rarely encountered, and that would be particularly true in the case of the family of beaked whales, which live in the deep seas. Secondly, in the case of others, such as the brooder's whales, which have not been well studied, what was once viewed as one global species, when subject to appropriate scientific scrutiny, turns out to be more than one. For example, in the Gulf of Mexico, what was previously treated as a separate population of brooder's whales is now known to be a distinct species. This is Rice's whale, or the Gulf of Mexico whale, or the American whale, the last name suggested because it is limited to USA waters, perhaps the only baleen whale species living within the territory of a single nation. And what a responsibility this now is, because there are only about 50 of them left in this very busy sea area. This is arguably the most endangered whale on Earth, and second only to the vaquita of the Gulf of California, which is the most endangered cetacean, with just a few individuals thought to be surviving. And another sad situation for the whales in the 21st century, just touched on by Chris Packham, was revealed in January 2019, when a dead and emaciated 38-foot-long Rice's whale washed up on the shore of Florida's Everglades National Park. Post-mortem revealed a single small, sharp piece of stiff plastic had perforated its stomach lining. There were no other injuries, one small piece of plastic, one small piece of marine debris had killed this mighty whale. Moving to my second example, that's a bottlenose dolphin. We all know what bottlenose dolphins look like, right? It is the most recognizable of all the cetaceans. But again, it is not just one global species. 2 species and 3 subspecies have so far been described. And here, in fact, is a photograph of another newly defined taxon. This is Lahili's bottlenose dolphin, a large form found in the coastal waters of West and South Atlantic Ocean off the coasts of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. And again, no sooner was it recognized in 2018 than it was realized to be in trouble. And there are perhaps only 360 mature individuals left, and the population is thought to be in decline. Due to their low numbers, high site fidelity, and restricted coastal distributions, Lahili's bottlenose dolphins are particularly sensitive to local anthropogenic impacts. And the same could be said of many small populations of other cetaceans living in close contact with us. Broadly, the factors threatening Lahili's dolphin look something like this, and we've already heard about some of them. There's fishing, bycatch, but also removal of prey, degradation and loss of habitat, shipping threatening ship strikes and disturbance, and also disturbance from recreational activities and chemical pollution, including substances which will affect the animal's health and their reproduction. And then we have discharges of solid wastes, garbage, adding to marine debris. And if we add to this slide the threats that would be affecting Bruder's whales, pretty much the same would be true for them, but we would also add oil spills, because noting the habitat of Rice's whale in the Gulf of Mexico, this is an area very busy in terms of oil production, and also whaling. Historically, these tropical whales, like many of the bigger whale species, were hunted, especially in their case from the 1970s, but they are still being hunted in Japan. And I must also mention noise pollution, because for animals that live in a medium where sound travels so much better than in air, and which primarily perceive their world using their remarkable and refined sense of hearing, the chronic noise pollution that we put into oceans from, in particular, our shipping, will disturb and fog their world. Additionally, the incredibly powerful noises that we use there for fossil fuel exploration or in marine military activities will at worst wound them and sometimes lead to their deaths. And we do need to now factor in the widespread effects of climate change. So this array of threats is a good indication of what is affecting cetaceans all over the world at the moment. Last year, more than 360 scientists from more than 40 countries, 2 of whom will be on your panel later on, released an open letter stating their grave concerns for cetaceans worldwide. And I'm going to quote from that letter. You can see it on the screen. The lack of concrete actions to address threats adversely affecting cetaceans in our increasingly busy, polluted and overexploited and human-dominated seas and major river systems means that many, one after another, will likely be declared extinct within our lifetimes. Even the large whales are not safe. The recent listing of the North Atlantic right whale as critically endangered reveals the serious failure of its relatively wealthy range state countries to address a critical decline. Moreover, the factors driving this ongoing decline are well known and we believe could be addressed. And they went on to highlight the other species and many discrete populations that have been found to be threatened. And they concluded by calling on countries to take precautionary action to ensure these species and populations are adequately protected and to strengthen the relevant international bodies, including the International Whaling Commission. Let us compare the current activities of the IWC with that list of threats that I've just shown you. And some of these have already been touched on, and you'll hear some more details when Sue Fisher takes the floor later on. But we have the Bycatch Mitigation Initiative. We have a global whale entanglement response network. We have the scientific committee's work. We have the task teams that Andre very kindly mentioned, including one for Lahili's bottlenose dolphins. And we have a slew of work under the Conservation Committee, including the conservation action plans for a number of taxa. And I really must not forget the climate change work that the scientific committee is overseeing at the moment, because their workshop starts a little later on this today. So this is a very dynamic situation with the IWC working in all these areas. Returning finally to those extraordinary orcas. Orcas are found all over the world. Many distinct populations with specific morphology and particular behaviors have now been recognized. Young whales learn from older whales. And in orca societies, the older female, perhaps the Jane Goodall of the troop, leads the pod, sharing the wisdom of her years and what she learnt from her forebears. Should we be seeking to conserve these cultural population units? Those populations, for example, that know how to exploit the resources in a particular habitat, such as where the good rubbing beaches are and where the fattest fish can be found at particular times of year. I will answer my own question, of course. Yes, we should. For their sakes and for the sake of the integrity of the marine systems that they are part of. And we need to recognize that these cultural units may be very vulnerable if we do something to suddenly alter their habitat and prey supply. And that could be through the effects of climate change or some other of our encroachments into the marine environment. Dominic, I have one take-home message I'd like to offer before I close, and that is that the more closely we look at cetaceans, the more we find out how remarkable they are, and the more it becomes apparent that they deserve and they need precautionary action from us to protect them and their distinct populations and their cultures and their habitats. The IWC is playing a significant role in this, and this should be supported and expanded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Wonderful and very thoughtful presentation on some of the key challenges we face protecting these incredible animals and the threats that we as humans most definitely pose to their existence. So thank you so much. We now have a short message by singer-songwriter and activist Leona Lewis. Thank you.
Whales and dolphins need a bold vision to protect them and their ocean habitat. I support the 50-year vision for the IWC because I want these magnificent marine giants to be around for generations to come.
Dominic, you were muted there, but I think you might have been introducing me.
I do. Sorry. I will introduce you again. Apologies. I'm going to introduce Sue Fisher. He's a leading member of Wildlife Countryside Link's Marine Mammal Whale Group. She's a marine consultant for the Animal Welfare Institute, an expert in international policy, legal and governance issues relating to protection of cetaceans. Sue's going to tell us a bit more about the IWC's vision for the future and how it needs to be equipped to meet the challenges of protecting these amazing animals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, and hello, everyone. I'm speaking today on behalf of more than 50 animal protection and conservation organizations from all around the world. The majority are advocates for cetaceans at the International Whaling Commission, some for as many as 6 decades. Many are involved in cetacean research and threat mitigation, covering every ocean of the world. With this continuity and expertise, NGOs are important stakeholders of the IWC. We hold much of its institutional memory, we're active participants in its current work, and we're invested in its future. So it's fitting for NGOs to come together in this 75th anniversary week to talk about the years ahead. Having said that, I'm actually going to start with a brief history of the IWC, because its remarkable evolution over the last 75 years explains best why we're so confident that it can address all those terrible threats to cetaceans that Mark has just outlined. And then I'll explain why it needs a 50-year vision. Almost 3 million great whales were killed in industrial whaling operations in the 20th century. Fleets of massive factory ships literally emptied the seas of these incredible animals, fundamentally changing the ecosystem. Until the IWC was created in 1946, these hunts were an absolute free-for-all. The situation wasn't much better after it was created. the IWC's small group of founding members were all whaling nations who mainly just continued their competition in the 1950s and 60s until they eradicated whole populations and drove species to the edge of extinction. Finally, the world woke up to what was happening in the 1970s and said enough. In 1982, the IWC prohibited all commercial whaling worldwide, and all but 3 whaling nations gave up for good. But although this landmark decision saved several species from extinction, we still had not saved the whale. As you heard from Mark, even 40 years later, many species are still nowhere near their pre-exploitation levels, and they all face the challenges he outlined of a highly degraded marine environment. So, having spent the first half of its existence dispensing commercial whaling quotas, what has happened at the IWC to convince us that it can now tackle all these new threats? Well, as the world changed around it, the IWC showed it could evolve. As the chair noted earlier, the IWC has always had a conservation as well as a management mandate, but they are not static. As times change, threats change, scientific understanding grows, human values evolve, and new global norms develop. And a progressive, outward-looking global organization changes with them. Although back in 1946, the IWC's founding treaty might not have explicitly recognized the value of protecting whales for the sake of the ecological services they provide, or to provide tourism income to coastal communities, or because they are sentient and can suffer, it didn't need to for those issues to become part of the IWC's mandate and a legitimate focus. Ending commercial whaling in the 1980s was a critical inflection point for the IWC. It now had the space to progress from exclusively managing the lethal use of whales to addressing non-lethal uses like whale watching. That new focus helped to bring in new members. 69 of the IWC's 88 current members joined after 1980. That in turn increased its income, its global reach and expertise, and its authority with several newer global organizations that were established to address biodiversity and sustainable development. Reflecting the increasing concerns of the public and the growing scientific fields of animal sentience and pain, those new IWC members cared about welfare issues too. Not just the humaneness of hunting methods, but the impact of harmful human activities other than whaling, including the increasing problems of entanglement in fishing gear and ocean noise. The IWC also expanded its consideration to human impacts on dolphins and porpoises, not just the large whales it originally focused on. Most recently, it has recognized the ecological and economic value of the non-use of cetaceans to maximize their biological contributions to ocean health, including transporting nutrients, boosting marine productivity, and even sequestering carbon. You'll hear more about this in our panel discussion. Some member governments claim that because these issues weren't explicitly recognized in the 1946 treaty, the IWC can't address them today. They argue it can only focus on hunting and owning of whales, but that's incorrect. When scholars use the tools of legal interpretation to understand the mandate of a body like the IWC, they don't just look at what the founders wrote in the treaty text or at its initial activities generations ago. A strong legal mandate can be shaped over time by its consistent practice in response to changing external factors. Clearly, the IWC's conservation and management mandates have been shaped by a world that's changed fundamentally since 1946, when to most nations, the only value of a whale was to produce oil to make armaments or margarine. So how has the IWC's conservation mandate evolved? With whaling banned, but other threats to cetaceans becoming impossible to ignore, in the 1980s, the IWC embarked on a program of study to better understand the animals themselves and the impacts of threats like climate change, pollution, and fisheries on them, so it could undertake more effective conservation. 20 years later, in 2003, the Commission established a conservation committee to work alongside its long-standing scientific committee, but with the specific task of mitigating the impact of those threats. I'm thrilled that we have the current chair of the Conservation Committee on our panel today. Almost 20 more years later, the IWC now has the experience and expertise to know which conservation measures work, and it has the reach and the credibility to lead that work globally. Today, it has an ambitious 10-year strategic plan for 6 of the priority threats to cetaceans: bycatch, ship strikes, marine debris, anthropogenic noise, pollution, and climate change. But to effectively tackle all these threats, and those we're still learning about, like zoonotic diseases, the IWC urgently needs a plan to replicate what's already working and to scale it up over the coming challenging years. As the chair noted earlier, the Bycatch Mitigation Initiative provides an excellent model for what works. It has a strategic plan, a work plan, a coordinator working in the Secretariat, and a large multidisciplinary panel of experts advising a standing working group. This efficient and cost-effective model has enabled the IWC to develop fisheries-specific bycatch mitigation solutions to be tested in pilot projects around the world. But each project will cost up to £300,000, funds that the IWC has not yet committed paying from its core funds. It will raise some of the costs from voluntary contributions from its members and from NGOs. But to really scale this up, the IWC must secure serious funds from outside sources. And I look forward to hearing more about the possibilities for that in our panel discussion. The IWC's ship strike work follows a similar model. Today, based on data it's collected since 2007 on collisions between ships and whales, the IWC can identify high-risk areas for cetacean and vessel interactions, and it can recommend tailored mitigation measures for different species and specific shipping sectors. But to be effective wherever whales are threatened by ship strikes, this too needs to be scaled up and seriously resourced. Growing and funding conservation work like this is our most urgent priority, but it's not the only focus of our vision. We also seek to consolidate the IWC's welfare mandate to ensure whale watching and ongoing subsistence whaling are well managed and maintain the critical ban on commercial whaling. We want to see more and more effective protected areas for cetaceans and ensure that all the IWC's decision-making reflects the value of the ecological contributions of cetaceans. To achieve all this, the IWC also needs to engage more with other organizations and, through capacity building and regional efforts, with its own 88 governments, so that their membership is truly valuable for them and justifies paying their annual fee. That sounds like a lot, but most of the foundations are already in place. What we need now, and what we're asking for today, is political will to take the next big steps. We think its 75th anniversary is an opportunity for another paradigm shift at the IWC, like the commercial whaling ban was in the 1980s. Some whaling is still happening, of course, and the IWC will always have a responsibility to manage it. But it also needs to look forward with confidence to a future that's not based on an outdated concept of whales as consumable products, but as engineers of their environment, as living engines of income for coastal communities, and simply as the unique, amazing, and vulnerable creatures that they are. The IWC already knows what needs to be done to save the whale. NGOs can raise concerns, suggest ideas, and push you, but ultimately governments need to step up and do the work towards a common vision. As Dr. Goodall said, we can't afford to fail. So on behalf of my co-hosting organizations and the 50+ other NGOs who support a practical, progressive, and achievable 50-year vision for the IWC, thank you for joining this webinar. And to the governments listening, please don't fail the whales.
Thank you very much, Sue, again for those wise words about the challenges that lie ahead and why it's so important that we must rise to them because the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. But thank you so much. We're now going to move to our panel session. We've been taking some questions in Q&A. It'll be introduced by Matt Collis, Deputy Vice President for Conservation at the International Fund for Animal Welfare. He'll take us through the panelists. We've got a wonderful panel of experts to really start to deliberate and discuss some of the key issues that we brought up on today's session. But before we do that, I want to introduce a short message from British sailor Tracy Edwards, MBE. Thank you.
Every single major threat faced by whales and dolphins has been caused by humans. We have a duty to put that right. I support the 50-year vision for the IWC because these amazing animals deserve so much better from us.
Thank you. I'll now hand over to Matt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to all our speakers so far. As Dominic mentioned, this is the final part of today's event where we'll host a panel discussion on the future of the IWC. I'm Matthew Collis, the Deputy Vice President for Conservation at the International Fund for Animal Welfare, or IFAW as we're often known. And IFAW as an organisation has participated in the IWC for many decades, much like many of our esteemed panellists have. And I'll introduce them all briefly now before turning to each with a specific opening question. As a reminder to our audience, if you have a question for the panel, please use the Q&A function to enter your question. I see there's already a few there, and we'll do our best to get to any more that come in as well. But we've also been receiving questions in advance of the event, so I can't promise that we'll manage to get to everything, but we'll do our best to get through as many of the issues as we can during the time we have. So to introduce our panel today, our panelists are Dr. Lorenzo Rochester. He's the coordinator of the Marine Mammal Research and Conservation Program for the UNDP Synergy Project in the National Commission of Natural Protected Areas in Mexico. And Lorenzo is also current chair of the Conservation Committee of the International Whaling Commission. We have Miguel Iniguez Visager, who's the alternate IWC Commissioner for Argentina and has been involved in cetacean conservation and research since 1984. He's the coordinator of the IWC's Conservation Management Plan for the Franciscana, convener of its anthropogenic underwater noise working group, and a member of the steering committee for the Southern Ocean Research Partnership. We have Claire Perry, who is the Ocean and Climate Campaign Leader for the Environmental Investigation Agency. She's carried out investigations into whale and dolphin hunting and cetacean product markets in Japan and Iceland, and is an expert on international environmental policy. We also have Dr. Joe Roman, who's a fellow and writer in residence at the Gund Institute of Environment at the University of Vermont. He has worked on the conservation, ecology, and history of whales for more than 20 years, with his research appearing in Science, Trends in Ecology and Evolution, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and other prominent journals. And finally, Dr. Ralph Shami, the Assistant Director and Institute for Capacity Development at the International Monetary Fund. Ralph is a co-founder of Rebalance Earth and Blue Green Future LLC, and has pioneered valuation of ecosystem services for keystone species such as great whales and forest elephants, and also developed a new framework for a nature-based economy. So many thanks to all our panelists for joining us today. And as I mentioned, I'll kick off with a question specific to each of you, and starting with you, Lorenzo. You've been chair of the IWC's Conservation Committee for a number of years now, and have seen the growth in a number of issues the IWC is trying to address, but also the initiatives aimed at addressing these, like the bycatch mitigation initiative that's been mentioned, or the work on disentanglement and strandings, among the many other issues. What, in your view, does the IWC need in order to be able to deliver more of these similar initiatives?
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks everybody for inviting me. And I'd like to congratulate all those speakers that did a fantastic job. I think we all would agree if we say that biodiversity conservation is a global issue, and the processes or the actions and their interests go far beyond national borders. And I'm speaking also thinking not only for globally distributed species, but also for endemic species that might be in one single country. So international collaboration, I think it's crucial to determine the outcomes of conservation actions. And also it's very important for conservation biologists to establish international interactions to gain knowledge at local levels. And I think that's something we have to continue doing. And I think we're doing or started to do recently a very good job on that. Another issue I think we need to cover is that conservation policy and practice can be and should be guided by the best available science, which we have in IWC. But usually it's the natural science that have tended to be the primary driver or discipline to lead any conservation recommendations or actions. And I think I would say that one of my first meetings in IWC, I wrote a paper, and I'm a biologist, but I wrote it together with an economist on how to deal a little with bycatch, specifically for vaquita. And I presented the paper to a few colleagues at IWC, and they said that there was no science on that because of the economy and social look at the problem of vaquita. That's over 20 years ago. Despite that, I think for a long time, researchers and stakeholders have recognized that there is a very important community participation that means both social and natural considerations for conservation. An example of that comes, I think, from the 1960s, a Sound County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, if you have the chance to read that. It's a great read, and also it's in Spanish, but in Mexico is a pioneer in looking at community participation in social science and conservation. So I think the social and economic science are one very important means through which we can attain better understanding and implementation of conservation actions. I think there's still some lack of awareness and scope and uncertainty about the purpose of, and I would say conservation social sciences, I like that term better, and how these conservation community effectiveness we can engage and reach that and understand that human dimension. So if we recognize that engaging with the human dimension of conservation is a must, and that's a must because we need to produce robust and effective conservation policies, actions, and outcomes, and we have started to do that with the BMI, the Bycatch Mitigation Initiative that Sue clearly presented, and also Mark. But how to integrate those social sciences insights into the conservation committee is limited now, and is something I think we need to develop and bring that conservation science or social sciences to and transdisciplinary approach to the conservation committee. And I think that would be another issue we need to improve. And finally, if I have a few minutes still, we have heard about baleen prey consumption based on high resolution foraging measurements. That's the paper that Savoca and colleagues published. And they conclude how baleen whales, and has been mentioned in our introductory speakers, that how much they influence the ecosystem through immense prey consumption and nutrient recycling. And I think that all these animals that are gigantic and ecosystem engineers, we have to put them, probably those at the center of what we do at the Conservation Committee. So the nucleus and the core part of our work should be the cetacean and ecosystem functioning. And then around it, we would need to work with all our priorities like ship strikes and climate change and marine debris. And years ago, last year, I drafted kind of a COVID virus that the center that was this cetacean ecosystem functioning, that the spike proteins were all our priorities in the Conservation Committee. So we have to keep, I think, that in mind when we do our work at the Conservation Committee. And I hope I was clear with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Yeah, much appreciated. And actually, I'm going to use your final point there to segue to Joe. And Dr. Joe Roman, you've spent a lot of time studying the incredibly important ecological role that whales play in the ocean. Can you give us a very simple summary of that role and highlight why you think it's important that this role is factored into decision-making by bodies like the IWC?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. And thanks everyone for this invite, and what an amazing group of people. And I was afraid that was going to happen. I'm sorry. I had a dog emergency. So you can hear a little barking in the background. Apologies for that. So you know, a lot of mention has already gone on to some of this work. So I'll give you guys a background of how I got there. Is about 30 years ago, I was working on the North Atlantic right whale. First time I ever saw one was on the Bay of Fundy. It came up, mud on its bonnet, fluked, and then put out an enormous fecal plume right in front of me. Really the first time I ever saw a whale. And I thought that was interesting, but over the years, it gave me an idea that maybe it was ecologically important too. So for about the past 20 years, we've been looking at what we call the whale pump. And the idea behind that is whales dive to feed, they come to the surface, and they release fecal plumes at the surface. And we've measured nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron, and shown that the release of these nutrients can actually have an impact on primary productivity, as well as zooplankton and fish as well. The project that I'm working on right now is looking at whales are known as capital breeders, that baleen whales, they feed part of the year and then they breed and fast for part of the year. And when they move to these low latitude systems with low nutrients, they release nutrients into those systems as well. It's what we call the great whale conveyor belt. So they're taking nutrients from areas with high primary productivity to areas like the Caribbean or Hawaii, or think of off the coast of Brazil, and releasing nutrients there. And we're right now getting an idea of what that might mean for the ecosystems of the low latitude ecosystems of the world. And then I think what's really important too is to think about whale falls. When whales die, they could go on coastlines. We've all seen strandings probably, and the loss of whales actually and other marine mammals had an impact on the California condor. When whales and marine mammals disappeared, the condors switched their prey and became vulnerable to lead poisoning because they were eating terrestrial prey instead of marine prey. But they also have a big impact on the deep sea. And we've been studying the impact when you lose whales. It's just like losing habitat. There are at least 100 species that are dependent on whales in the deep sea. They feed on their bones, they feed on the flesh. And the models that we put together suggest that perhaps the first human-caused extinctions in the oceans were these deep sea species, and they disappeared even before we knew they existed. We still have a chance to help protect not only the whales, but the hundreds of other species that depend on them in the deep sea. And then finally, I think, and this is all moving beyond the traditional ecological studies of whales as predators, right? There have been many studies of how much whales eat, dozens, maybe hundreds, but there have been very few studies only in the past 10 years of all the other interesting ways that they play a role in ocean ecosystems. And one compelling one is whales as prey. We're not the only animals that hunt large whales, killer whales do too. And when we lost large whales, some studies suggest that as those whale populations declined because of commercial whaling, the killer whales, which only eat marine mammals, switched to prey and may have had an impact on pinnipeds as well as sea otters, which had an effect on kelp systems. This is described as a trophic cascade. I find all of this work fascinating, or I wouldn't do it, but what does it matter, right? You know, how does this help decision makers think about whales in new ways? Well, one is we're moving beyond, we all know this, it's been discussed a couple of times already today, the idea of just seeing whales as either our competition or as consumers, but they also have a really important role in enhancing primary productivity through this pump or this conveyor belt. They have an important part of biodiversity. They're like keystone players in deep sea biodiversity. A lot of folks have already discussed the really important cultural ecosystem services that whales bring about. And again, moving beyond this very simplistic view. And then some of the work that my colleagues and I have done is also thinking about the value of stewardship. We often tend to overlook that, but we looked in Massachusetts. The amount of funds that people donate to protect marine life in Massachusetts is more than the entire finfish economy in that system, and it's equal to whale watching. So remember, I mean, many of us here that are work in this field, we're an important part of the economy too. So whale researchers and whale stewards also play an important role. And then, as has been mentioned, I think they also can play a very important part in the carbon cycle, especially when whales die. That's a nascent. We're just starting to understand that. And you've all discussed this today, thinking about recognizing, as Michael Moore notes, that we're all whalers. We may have stopped commercial whaling, but there are ship strikes, there are fisheries entanglements, there's ocean noise. There are many things we can do beyond commercial whaling. With that, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to have a discussion further about any of these in detail or take it in a new direction. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks so much for those.
Apologies for the dog.
There wouldn't be a webinar without a dog or a child in the background. So, moving to you, Miguel. Thinking of some of the points that Joe had just raised there about, you know, just how important the range of services that whales provide for us. Argentina and indeed a number of the other Latin American countries at the IWC have been very much at the forefront of pushing the IWC to value whales alive, you know, initially for the opportunities that provided for coastal communities in many of those countries and around the world for whale watching, but also more recently this issue of the ecological benefits that whales provide to healthy oceans. What do you believe that IWC needs to do more of in the future to kind of broaden its appeal to wider audiences, and particularly those from the global south who might have previously looked at it simply as a kind of whalers club? You know, what does it need to do to broaden that appeal?
Thanks, Matt, and hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Well, the first thing to recognize is that the IWC has evolved from a body that regulates whaling to a body that is leading reference for the conservation of all cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. As evidence of this is the resolutions that was adopted by the IWC. So most of the Latin American countries that are members of the IWC have been part of the so-called Buenos Aires Group since 2005. Some of its members were present on the 2nd of December 1946 when the convention was signed in Washington, because they were commercial whaling countries at that time: Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and Argentina. 6 of the 15 countries that signed the ICRW. So the world has evolved and the countries of the region have evolved, and today these countries form a solid conservationist bloc. So with respect to the IWC, it seems to me that it should show and make its work and programs such as the bycatch, the mitigation initiative, the conservation management plan, the task teams, all the work that is developed under the conservation committee with, of course, the very strong support of the scientific committee. So it's necessary to make more visible and reinforce even more its influence in the decisions that are adopted in other conventions. So especially taking into account the role that cetaceans have in the conservation of the oceans and therefore of the planet. For example, through carbon sequestrations, whale pump, transportation of nutrients. So the reason why the Buenos Aires Group is supporting and is a very strong conservationist bloc can be explained by the fact that every single country in Latin America, except Paraguay, because they do not have cetaceans in their waters, for example, develop whale watching activities that involve the big whales, some particularly or special dolphins as the South American river dolphins, some endemic species as Commerson's dolphins, Peale's dolphins, just to mention a few of them. But in the last year, we were pushing very much this idea of the role of the cetaceans as a ecosystem, the oceanic engineers. So and we understand that this is a new huge role, as I said before, to protect and save our oceans and therefore our planet. So I believe this is very important, and we need to keep working very much on that. Thanks.
Just a reminder to our audience also, I neglected to say this at the beginning, even though all our panelists are speaking in English, you can ask questions in French or Spanish. We have people who are able to translate those, and I can relay them to the panel. So please don't feel like you only have to type your questions in English if there's anyone listening via our interpretation that wants to ask a question in French or Spanish. Claire, Miguel touched on an important point there, which is much of the work, or indeed the threats and the work of the IWC to address those threats, relies on other bodies to change the way they work in order to deliver on addressing those threats. And it's, for you, as someone who spent a long time observing and participating in the IWC, but also many other environmental agreements, do you see opportunities for the IWC to engage more with these other bodies in order to be able to deliver this kind of conservation work that Miguel's touched on there?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the question, and hello, everyone. Do I see opportunities for the IWC? Yes, absolutely. First of all, it's important to recognize that there has been quite a lot of engagement already, and it's been very successful across many different fora. We've heard about the development of the bycatch mitigation initiative and so on, and engagement with the FAO. There's many other conventions and initiatives that the IWC, the Scientific Committee and the Conservation Committee have already engaged with. There's also a lot of political will to do this from the majority of IWC contracting governments. It's already in the mandate of the IWC through multiple resolutions. Just at the last meeting, I think there were decisions on cetaceans in the ecosystem, on ghost gear, on underwater noise, the Florianopolis Declaration. All of these resolutions, some of which were agreed by consensus, talked about collaboration, coordination with other treaties and other initiatives. So if we look back just a few months, a few weeks to the recent UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, I think, as already mentioned by Dominic, the central role of the ocean and ocean biodiversity was very much in evidence. And the COP26 outcome reflected that. The final COP26 decision, for example, had text that reinforces a link between the ocean, the climate, the biodiversity, and the need to address them together. So there are now various work programs and bodies under the UNFCCC which will be looking how to do this. There will be an annual climate ocean dialogue starting, I think, in June next year, which will help promote cooperation across different fora and initiatives. And then if we look forward a few months, we have the 5th UN Environment Assembly meeting in February, where it's widely expected that, or hoped at least, that countries will agree to start negotiations of a new global treaty on plastic pollution. So this is obviously highly relevant to cetaceans, which are increasingly impacted by plastic. And an important pillar of this new treaty that we're looking to achieve will be monitoring and reporting of plastic pollution and its impacts. And of course, here whales are critical as the sentinels of the ocean. In fact, a new paper came out very recently looking at whales feeding off the coast of New Zealand, where I think they estimated that they consume as many as 3 million microplastics per day. and that most of that comes from their food. But as the authors of this new paper pointed out, the baleen whales are filtering large amounts of seawater, and they're essentially continuously sampling both from their environment and their prey when they feed to their highly relevant indicator species. And so my take on all of this, and the reason I sort of mentioned those two examples, is that the Convention on Climate Change and this new global plastic treaty, like many other fora, will need collaboration with organizations like the IWC in order to fulfill their mandates. And importantly, resources will be mobilized for these efforts. So I think the IWC can certainly benefit from those resources. It has a lot to do.
A perfect segue there to Ralph, with mention of resources. Ralph, you've undertaken a lot of work to demonstrate how we can value the important ecological services whales and other animals provide, but also showing that our current economic models are failing to take these into account. How can we ensure that decision-making is accounting for the value of these kind of services, and critically perhaps for the IWC and other international organizations, many of which face severe funding difficulties? How can we ensure that these get applied in the real world to create those new revenue streams and resources that Claire referred to there?
Thank you, Matt. First of all, it's wonderful to be part of the anniversary and part of this panel. And hi, Joe. Haven't seen Joe in a while. I'm glad that I came after all of them and all of the speakers, and especially Clara, because she put her finger on something. At COP26, I was there. It was for the first time that I saw a realization that what we're facing is a dual risk, not only climate risk, but the death of the natural capital. In particular, when we say natural capital, it's an economic jargon, but basically, you know, the threat to nature, in particular to the oceans and to the whales and to cetacean, non-cetaceans, and animals on land. So why is that important for the question you asked me? Is because we need to contextualize how to act in this case. What should be the policy action? Well, the policy action is not done in vacuum, is done in context. And right now we are in an incredible point in history where all of the stakeholders realize that we are facing gloom and doom, but there is a way out. And the way out is to connect nature and the value of nature to the fight to the climate change, because then you bring the resources of the governments and the private sector into both. So we can use the protection of the whales and of the oceans, for example, okay, and not to go beyond just, you know, what we're used to for all these years, which is philanthropic giving and feeling for to basically bring in hardcore finance into this area, because you're asking me, second question is about funding. And I'm a financial economist, I'm not a scientist, and I know the markets very well, and the markets are keen to come into this space. They're saying, bring us into this, help us come into this space, help us fund IWC, help us fund the scientists, show us how to do so, you see? Now, if you want them to come in, one way to come in a healthy way, because they can also come in a way that not necessarily be healthy, is to help them understand that the solution to the climate change is the protection and regeneration of nature. If we're talking about the whales, helping the whales recover, because they are the fighters of in the climate change battle. That's what I did strategically in the 2019 paper. I on purpose put in the whales as not only to protect the whales for themselves, of course, but as their fighters for, you know, against the climate change. So now the question becomes, well, okay, is this enough to bring in the trillions of dollars that are sitting in the private sector? And the answer is no. You need to do more. What is it that, so the science, Joe's science and other scientists have already told us how valuable they are. Okay. I come around and with my colleagues and we value you know, we just take the value that's already in the science and we translate it into dollars and cents. Is that enough? to get the money, to marshal all those funds in a healthy way? And the answer is no. What the markets need to see is action, not words. Markets look at things in terms of assets, natural assets. But for an asset, for something to be called an asset, and it has to be taken seriously by the financial markets, the governments have to say the whale, every government where these whales matter, and hopefully they're a global public good, so maybe we can all agree, they are national treasures or they are global treasures. And if it's not enough just to make that declaration, is to say, if you hurt a whale, there's at least one estimate of the value of the services of a whale of $3 million. That's the penalty. You're asking me what is the action? I'm telling you, this is the action. Why? Because once that is done, then what you've done, you've valued the asset and you've codified it in the law. Once you codify it in the law, it becomes what finance people like me understand, it becomes capital, which means it comes on the balance sheets of governments, if you like, where these whales reside, or on the global balance sheet. That means the markets then say, oh, so that's an asset in the water. So if a ship hits a whale, oh, guess what? They're going to have to pay a penalty. Oh, wait a minute. So I'm Lloyd's of London. I've insured those tankers. You know what? Come here, man. I'm not going to insure you anymore against hitting a whale because there's a penalty now. You see? You change the view of the markets. But of course, that's just the beginning of the game. The next thing, what would happen is IT companies would come around and say, look, I can put this gadget on the ship that would keep you away from the whale. Already, the Chileans are doing it with the Blue Boat Initiative, okay? So what happens now, you bring in the markets in a healthy way to protect and regenerate the whales, help them recover. So quick answer to your question, we need policy action, enough words, enough songs about the whales, enough poetry about the whales and about the ocean. It's all this is nice. The action is the whale is a national public good. If it's a resident whale, fine. It's in your resident waters. It's a national treasure. It has a value for hurting it. Let's be like New Zealand. They conferred personhood on their rivers. You hurt a river in New Zealand, you go to jail and you pay a fine. We can do the same with the whales. The markets then realize they can create services around the whales. This is how you can go from, sort of, yes, they're very important, to basically changing them to becoming assets in the views of the markets. But those assets only have value as long as the whale is alive and well. So then you're building a whole economy around a living and thriving nature, in this case, the whale. I'm trying to be succinct.
No, absolutely. And I'm aware we're very short on time. So I'm going to, we've had a lot of questions in, and I'm perhaps going to take a bunch that might be possible to paraphrase in there. And because it's been a constant theme of the discussion today around the evolution of the IWC, but people have been asking questions about addressing small cetacean hunts, or even the question of whether the IWC and the original convention needs to be rewritten for the modern day, as it were. A question to some of our panelists, do we think that needs to be the case? Are we talking evolution, or are we talking a total rewrite or a rethink to match the paradigm we find ourselves in today? So maybe I'll go to Lorenzo and Miguel first, as existing IWC embedded in the IWC architecture and decision making. Is it one that needs rewriting, or are we just in a case of evolution? Sorry, Lorenzo first.
Yeah, oh God, that's a hard question. But Sue, I think she covered in her presentation partly how we can do that. But I would say it's not an easy to rewrite that convention and keep the membership in there. I mean, there's so many complicated political issues that might not be easy, but I think it would be, what we can do is what Rolf just said recently. And I was trying to explain when I finished my first participation, is ecosystem services by whales. That's, I think, something we can do and we can push without rewriting the whole convention. just making sure that it's cetaceans and ecosystem functioning, and what we do in IWC around it, that's our core goal. And we can then move, as Ralph was explaining. I think that's an easier route than trying to convince all member governments and going through big discussions to rewrite a convention that we will never agree to if we change it. So that would be my first thought.
And there was a related question as well about, competency or not of the IWC over small cetaceans. But Miguel, you've been involved very directly indeed with the conservation management plan on the Franciscana, but also much of the scientific committee's work on small cetaceans. To some extent, we're kind of already there, perhaps. But I'll let you comment on that question again of evolution versus kind of legal mandates.
Yeah. Well, first, I totally agree with what Lorenzo expressed before. I think we need to look for some new ideas to incorporate, and the idea of the ecosystem functioning as part of. We need to highlight very much at the IWC and work on that. Regarding small cetaceans, for me, the small cetacean is incorporated in the IWC already. We are working very hard, especially from the scientific committee. There are a subcommittee just focused on small cetaceans, and there are some initiatives that incorporate this. For example, you mentioned the conservation management plans. Although it's quite new as a program, the Franciscana was the first small cetaceans to be incorporated as in these CMPs, and the CMPs began in 2012, and the Franciscana's CMP was already established in 2016, and now it was adopted or by the scientific committee as well as by the conservation committee, the South American river dolphins CMP. So in those ideas, in a small cetacean, we are making progress. Of course, we would like to see something more or to move more quickly, but I recognize that we are working very hard, and the IWC is involved in a small cetacean through different programs. As I mentioned, the CMP, the task teams, the bycatch mitigation initiative too, ship strikes and all other programs that of course incorporate small cetaceans too.
Thanks, Miguel. And just conscious we're going to lose our interpreters, so 10-second final word from our other panelists, if there's anything you want to reflect on, either in the questions that have just come from the audience or anything else. I'll go to you first, Claire.
Well, I agree with what the last two panelists said. I think the IWC has a very exciting future. When you think about it, it's done an incredible job to overcome its highly inauspicious beginnings. It started as a collection of countries that measured whales on the basis of the amount of oil they could get from them. One blue whale was worth 2 fin whales, which was equivalent to 6 sei whales. It's come on so far and developed into a very important international conservation body that's doing incredible work. There are increasing opportunities, as I was laying out before, to develop this mandate. And I think I do believe it has already the institutions and the sort of framework to do that. It just needs investment. And above all, as Sue was saying earlier, it needs political will from the contracting governments of the IWC in order to meet its potential.
I think that's a great point. Just finally, for Joe and Ralph, as IWC outsiders, perhaps compared to our other panelists, do you see a rosy future for it too? Insiders have said there's much that is being done and more that can be done. Do you see that too, Joe?
I don't know if I don't want to tinge the future. I don't know which way it'll go, but certainly the people here that have gathered here, I'm really excited to see this shift. I was thrilled to hear from Barbara and Sue and a bunch of other folks a couple of years ago and seeing this move forward. So I really think there's a lot of opportunity. From my own view, and they've been mentioned, the Gulf of Mexico whale, the North Atlantic right whale, these ones that are highly endangered, I hope there'll be more focus on those because they really need our help as well, in addition to the more numerous ones. And thank you again for the invite all.
And final word, Ralph.
I fully agree with my colleagues. I think IWC is incredibly needed, especially now, especially in light of everybody's asking what, COP26, it started with COP25, recognition of the whales when the Chileans came in with that, recognition of the ocean. And now COP26, they've linked it to the climate more concretely. And so IWC is sitting right there. And everybody, the way I would think about it is, what is the vision? Where do you want to go? And then how do we reorganize ourselves better, bring in new resources, bring in new thinking, such that we achieve that vision? But I fully agree with what Lorenzo was saying, that you don't need to disband because we don't have much time. If you believe that climate change is upon us, and the death of natural capital is also advancing very quickly, we don't have time to recombine and then sit back and kind of think about these things. We just need to say, okay, where do we want to go and how best to get there? And what else do we need? Do we need more funding? I'm telling you, the financial markets would come to your door and say, here's the money, here, help us, because you can guide them in, you can bring them in. We need to bring them in a healthy way. Because I'm a financial economist. I've seen money come in and not do great things for countries or places. So you have the mandate to bring them in a scientific way, in a good way, for the betterment of nature, for communities, indigenous population, and for everybody. So you can have a win-win-win. You have that mandate. It's just that, as we've all been saying, we need that political will to say, okay, we're going to do this and watch. We have never been there before, Matt, never. The financial markets were never in this. I tell you, because I come from there. Now they're here. Consumers are here. The industry is here. The policymakers are here. What are we waiting for? You guys just have to basically say what you want and then watch and bring them in. You have the science, you have the mandate. You bring them in the right way so that we get to all benefit from this and create sustainable prosperity and to all humanity.
Thank you, Ralph. And thank you to all our panelists, and apologies for those who asked questions in the audience that we didn't manage to get to. We're out of time here, but much appreciations again to all our panelists and previous speakers. And I'll hand back to you, Dominic, to wrap us up.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Matt, and all that panel. I think a huge amount of expertise and knowledge that goes back so many years. And I think, from me, I go back to what Jane said at the beginning and what Ralph was saying to close. The health of the oceans is about our own health and our own future. And I think there can be no question with the work I do every day and many other people in the organizations that have worked on this event, we know that the public are hugely engaged on the protection of the oceans and species, and they are deeply concerned about whales and dolphins being killed wherever it might be it in Japan, be it in the Faroe Islands. I could go through a list of places that you're all familiar with where things are going on that people are horrified and want action on. Now, the IWC can't necessarily step up and deal with all these problems immediately, but I think the one thing I take away from this event is that the IWC has a history of huge movement towards conservation and protection, from setting up originally to manage what was the killing of these species in terrible numbers. And they've evolved and changed and brought about considerable beneficial change. And the organization has a hugely important role to play going forward. I think I've taken from this event today that there's a clear commitment within the IWC, but also within the conservation and business sector, I hope, to work with the IWC to build on that vision for the future. And so the next 50 years will be a period by which we'll learn from the mistakes of the past, and we will protect the precious whales and other cetaceans to make sure that our oceans are healthy and that we can tackle climate change as well. It's a huge, huge, ambitious challenge we face as the human race, but we can't afford to lose this battle. But I think today has been a wonderful opportunity just to take stock of how important this organization is in fighting that battle. So thank you so much. I'm going to leave the closing words today to a wonderful actress, Dame Judi Dench. Thank you.
It's time for governments to ensure that whales and dolphins finally survive.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.